Seattle, Washington has always been on my bucket list. The closest I've come to visiting this famous Space Needle, though, is Missoula, Montana, a lifetime ago back in the summer of 1988. Some 20 months later, Seattle grunge bands Nirvana and Pearl Jam wrestled for the top spot on the Billboard charts. Residents of the Pacific Northwest were anticipating the arrival of spring's warmer weather, and the quaint Seattle suburb of Queen Anne appeared to be the bullseye and the target of an axe murderer stalking the residential neighborhoods in the dead of night. While police investigators knew better, most in the Seattle suburb would cite March 13, 1990 as the beginning of the killer's reign of terror. On that day, a resident named Geneva McDonald, age 63, was discovered in her Bigelow Avenue home, dead. Now, I'm not going to go into any sort of graphic detail about Geneva's injuries. They were gruesome and concentrated about the face and head. And I did say there was an axe murderer on the loose, so you get the gory picture. Now, under normal circumstances, I would respectfully address the victim as Mrs. McDonald, but for our purposes, I'm going to continue to refer to her by her very cool first name, Geneva. By all rights, Geneva was the walking definition of a pillar of the community. She was the type of friendly neighbor anyone would want to have. She was conscientious and hardworking, employed as a secretary for a shipbuilding company. And she was a devoted mom. Since her divorce, Geneva lived alone, but she remained extremely close to her daughter Paula, who was in her early 20s. Paula lived nearby and was in regular contact with her mother. So it was instantly alarming to Paula as well as Geneva's co-workers when she didn't report to work for 2 days. She had called off sick on Sunday night, saying she would not be in on Monday. But when no one had seen or heard from her by Tuesday, they became concerned. As I'd said, Geneva was a very responsible person, and it was not like her at all to go MIA. Her best friend had also been trying to reach her, so when a handful of phone calls were not returned, she drove to Geneva's home and went around the back as she normally did. She found Geneva's car there and the back door to the house unlocked. This was immediately unsettling to her friend, who entered the house anyway, calling out Geneva's name. She wound her way through the tidy home and finally made it upstairs to the master bedroom. There she found a bloody, horrific scene that sent her running outside in a panicked effort to find help for her friend. But it was too late. Geneva was gone. She had been killed in a savage attack, the likes of which investigators had not seen before. So, on March 13, 1990, investigators deemed the home a crime scene. There was no doubt that Geneva's death had been a homicide. It was apparent as well that this was no ordinary killer. First, they took note of the weapons resting on the bed. A fire axe and a pair of sewing scissors lay crisscrossed on the comforter. Further, an examination of the body determined that Geneva had been killed by blows to her face and head with the axe. But the scissors were used later, after she had already passed. There were numerous post-mortem scissor cuts on the body. They found several other bizarre things at the crime scene. For one, there was an indentation in the pillow in the immaculate guest room, along with a dark hair that clearly did not belong to red-haired Geneva. The killer had taken a nap following the grisly murder. There were other signs, too, that he had lingered in the house, which was not standard murderer behavior at all. There were indications in the bathroom that he had attempted to wash up, even though he had left trace evidence from the victim in the sink. Geneva's purse and jewelry box had been rifled, but nothing appeared to be missing. And, possibly strangest of all, there were banana peels in the kitchen, indicating that either before or after his nap, the killer had treated himself to a healthy snack. As they studied the crime scene, one of the officers noted something very, very mysterious. The axe handle had already been processed, as evidenced by the black fingerprint powder on the long handle. Now, what could that mean? Did it come from an evidence locker? Was there a killer cop on the loose? Spidey senses were standing on end, and everybody at that eerie crime scene had a major case of the willies. It soon came to light that the axe had been processed 5 days earlier as part of a different bizarre incident. One of Geneva's neighbors had awoken one morning and stumbled downstairs to find an axe. His axe, and yes, that axe, resting in the middle of his living room floor. Nothing else in his home had been disturbed. There was simply an axe taunting him before he could have his morning coffee. This was no prank. This was scary stuff. The uneasy homeowner promptly phoned police. He confessed that he had inadvertently left his back door unlocked the night before. After they dusted the tool for fingerprints, the axe was returned to the neighbor, who for some unknown reason decided to put it back outside on his porch. Forensic examination concluded that the fingerprints on the axe handle did in fact belong to the tool's owner. So here they were, 5 days later, in the home of the late Geneva McDonald. Now retired, Detective Stephen O'Leary and Detective Bob Gibo interviewed those closest to Geneva, daughter Paula and Geneva's ex-husband. After just a bit of questioning, though, both were cleared as possible suspects. They had neither the motive nor the inclination to kill Geneva, who really was adored by all who knew her. Her ex-husband made it clear that they experienced an amicable divorce years earlier, but had remained on good terms. And Paula was no killer. She was absolutely devastated by the loss of her mother, and the tragedy would haunt her for years to come. So, what about the axe owner neighbor, identified as Paul DeBarros? Police re-interviewed him. He confirmed that on the night of Geneva's homicide, his axe had disappeared from his back porch. It was promptly identified as the murder weapon of Geneva McDonald, and the neighbor, too, was ultimately alibied and cleared. Several weeks later, as the investigation continued in earnest, a young couple staying overnight with friends in the Queen Anne neighborhood were attacked in their bed. Around 4 a.m., the male was stabbed by a man in dark clothing wielding a butcher knife. The woman's screams and 911 call caused the attacker to flee before authorities could arrive. Actually, flee is probably the wrong word. He left almost casually, they explained, seemingly in no hurry to get away. The victim, Ian Warren, survived but could only identify the intruder as a white male. Again, he had entered through an unlocked back door. Now, just a little aside here. Before I started my YouTube channel, my husband had zero interest in true crime stories. I drove him crazy in our old house, asking every night, "Are we locked up?" His man cave was downstairs, and I'd secure all the doors only to find later that he'd let the dogs out, retrieve something from the shed or some other thing. Then he would come back inside and occasionally leave the back door unlocked. It made me nuts, but he thought I was just paranoid. Now we live in a ranch house with no basement, and I am responsible for the home security. And, thanks to Scary Clary, even he balks at the complacency of others in my stories who don't double-check the deadbolt. So, take this one piece of advice, people, and lock up. Anyway, back to the axe murderer. By this point, Seattle residents were terrified, and investigators were confused. Random stranger murders weren't the norm, and they weren't sure if they had one assailant or two. The recent attack had involved a knife, but Geneva McDonald had been killed with a fire axe and stabbed with sewing shears. In most cases, a brutal homicide like Geneva's would indicate rage and a personal hatred for the victim, but that seemed very unlikely in the McDonald case. What exactly was going on in quaint little Queen Anne? The second crime scene involving the couple in the guest room produced no new leads. However, there was a single handprint found on a door jamb in Geneva's home that did not belong to her. Investigators were hopeful, but at that time they had no suspect to compare the print to. And AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system, was brand new technology. It tested for fingerprints, sure, but in 1990 it had not expanded to the examination of handprints. So that evidence sat for a bit on the back burner, awaiting the time it could be compared to a suspect. They didn't have to wait long. There was a third incident involving a prowler. In the dead of night, a woman was jarred awake by someone at her downstairs window. She woke her brother, who had the foresight to grab his camera before confronting a potential axe murderer at the door. He yanked the front door open and flashed a picture. The startled prowler this time did flee. He got out of there fast. The film was developed by the police immediately, and a somewhat blurry close-up of the suspect emerged. He was a burly guy with dark hair and glasses. Now they were getting somewhere. Despite the use of different weapons, they were convinced they were looking for one perpetrator. Several nights later, they received yet another call. A woman, upon being alerted by her frantic barking dog, had secured an intruder downstairs in her basement. Her husband placed a call to 911 announcing, "Come quick, we caught the axe murderer." With lights and sirens blaring, police raced to the scene and arrested the man. He was armed with a 7-inch knife. He entered the house through an unlocked basement window. Not the same as the previous incidents, but pretty close. They charged the intruder, ID'd as Stephen Ramirez, with second-degree burglary. Then they compared him to the photo. There was maybe a little bit of a resemblance. But he denied that he had any involvement in Geneva's murder. He was there to get in, grab some valuables, and get out. So detectives couldn't be sure if they had their guy or not. Regardless, news of the arrest spread throughout the community, and residents breathed a huge sigh of relief. The monster, the madman, was finally off the streets. Or was he? I'll just fill you in. He wasn't. Ramirez sat in jail while they ran his prints, and his handprint did not match the one found at the Bigelow crime scene. It was soon confirmed that the real killer was still out there when police were called to yet another Queen Anne home. They entered the house only to be taunted by the suspect's twisted handiwork in blood-red Sharpie. He had drawn huge X's on the backs of the chairs in the kitchen, and he scrawled, quote, "The killer is back," end quote, on the wall leading up to the second floor. And, scariest of all, he had left a fire axe, taken from the homeowner's woodpile inside the tidy residence. The sick twist was delighting in scaring all of Seattle and taunting the police. With Ramirez in jail, though, they briefly wondered if they'd captured a copycat. The media coverage of the story had been extensive. It could just be someone copying the killer's movements in a pathetic need for attention. Then they saw it, and they knew. Authorities had never released details about the partial banana found on the floor at the McDonald homicide. But here in this house, they found a banana, casually tossed onto the floor, just like before. Now they knew Ramirez was a burglar with some poor timing, but he was not the killer they were desperately hunting. Forensic investigators scrutinized this new crime scene and were ecstatic to find a fingerprint and palm print on a pane of glass. They put a rush on the examination and identified the prints as belonging to 36-year-old James Cushing. Cushing had been arrested for arson after setting a fire at a group home in Washington where he had been living at the time. He also had a history of mental illness but refused to take his meds. They compared his prints obtained at the time of the arson arrest to those found on Geneva's door jamb. They were a match. Now they had to find him. They started with a visit to Cushing's mother, who told of many occurrences of violence and rage displayed by her son throughout his whole life. He was obsessed with Lizzie Borden, the Massachusetts woman suspected of murdering her father and stepmother with an axe in 1892. Just before Geneva's murder, his mother woke late one night to find James standing over her, laughing. He was nude, standing beside her bed and stabbing along the outline of her form under the covers with a large knife. She ran screaming from her bedroom and found every sharp object in the house laid out in perfect order in the living room. Imagine it, your own son, naked and laughing, plotting God only knows what. Ice picks, knives, salad forks, I don't know, but it's truly the stuff of nightmares and thrillers. Cushing's mother stood frozen in fear, but he left that night without harming her. Now learning that Cushing was a transient, police scoured the city looking for him. They needed to find him and stop him before he could kill again. They visited homeless shelters and learned Cushing had a favorite restaurant. They staked out the Mecca Cafe in the surrounding area and waited. Finally, on Thursday, September 13th, exactly 6 months after Geneva's murder, police arrested James Cushing at the corner of 4th and Stewart. Detectives O'Leary and Gabo were tasked with interrogating Cushing. Initially, they both found him unassuming and were incredulous that he could be the axe murderer they'd been hunting. But in short order, they learned Cushing liked to talk and he loved attention. His face literally lit up as he recounted how he'd killed that lady with the axe and stabbed the unlucky house guest with a knife, nearly causing his death. Cushing's mental illness was a big factor in the trial. His counsel attempted to defend his murderous actions by explaining that his mother had contracted German measles while pregnant with him, and he had suffered spinal meningitis as an infant. The lawyer claimed that his off-the-charts temperature of 107 degrees Fahrenheit caused brain damage. He had a long documented history of hospital visits and unsuccessful treatments for said mental illness, which according to his lawyer made him insane and unable to discern right from wrong. The judge and jury disagreed, and they found him guilty of aggravated murder, first-degree attempted murder, and a host of other crimes related to the break-ins. He was sentenced to life without parole and is currently serving his time at the Washington Correctional Facility in Monroe. In a final note, Geneva's daughter never recovered from her grief over her mother's death. I have not been able to find a cause of death for Paula Usual, but she passed away tragically at the age of 29.